Welcome to this episode of the Essential Church Podcast, an ongoing conversation about some of the most important issues facing the local church today. I'm your host, Andrew Arndt, and today I'm going to take you to a conversation that Pastor Jay Duncan, the pastor of New Life Midtown, and I had with Chuck DeGroat, the author of When Narcissism Comes to the Church. He's a professor of pastoral care and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary and a licensed therapist, and this topic has been a hot topic in society and in the church at large over the last bunch of years. And Chuck's book is a really beautiful look at what narcissism is, how it happens in our church structures, and what we can do to heal ourselves and our communities from its toxic effects. This is part one of our interview that we have with Chuck. Look for part two next week. And so without further commentary from me, here's to the conversation. Well, we're really happy today to welcome our friend Chuck DeGroat to the podcast. Chuck, for those of you who don't know, is a professor of counseling and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan. He's a licensed therapist who, after pastoring for a number of years, transitioned into training clergy in issues of abuse and trauma, conducting pastor and church planter assessments, consulting with churches, and then helping with investigations of abuse among pastors and within congregations. And he's the author of this book, which I read late last year, and it blew me away. I think it's a timely book, an important one for us to be talking about now. It's When Narcissism Comes to Church, Healing Your Community from Emotional and Spiritual Abuse. And narcissism has been a very prevalent topic of late in the church, and Chuck has done a fantastic job just kind of laying out what he understands narcissism to be, how he sees it functioning in the church, and then also what we can do to heal ourselves and our community from it. So, Chuck, we're really happy to have you on the podcast today.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thank you.
Well, before we get into the context or the content of the book, I would love it if you just give us some narrative context for it. So we said off camera just a second ago, I think a lot of times it's not so much the author that chooses the topic, but the topic kind of chooses them. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking for a couple minutes about what got you writing this in the first place.
Are you calling me a narcissist? It chose me? What? Where is this going? We just started, you guys.
We're off on the wrong foot, aren't we? For the record, I don't think Chuck is a narcissist, although also for the record, I mean, we haven't known each other all that long. So depending on what comes out in this.
To be determined.
That's right.
Well, I'll tell you this. I never dreamed that I'd write a book on this topic. And I'd written something that was really near and dear to my heart, a book called Wholeheartedness. And I kind of thought this is where I'll spend my time. I was leading retreats on that kind of stuff. But really what this came out of was I was doing some consulting, investigating for a large mega church. And in that process, the pastoral staff, they were looking for resources on this topic, on narcissism, abuse, and the like. And over the course of the 6 months, I was helping them. Obviously, they found my help valuable. And at the end of our time together, they said, you ought to write about this. Write something accessible, write something for pastors, for the church, in language that people can understand. And I said, no way. I don't want to do that. Not interested. But through a series of events, I ended up pitching it to a couple of publishers. IVP was very interested in the topic, and I was off to the races. And so it turns out people were way more interested in this topic than they were in Wholeheartedness or anything else I'd ever written, right? And especially when it came out about 3 years ago, there were several other books that were written on a similar topic. You've probably seen some of them out there. And then some podcasts, and it seems like now over the last 3 years, a lot of people are talking about this topic.
Yeah, what's the reception to the book been like?
You know, I would say 90% positive. There are always some who will push back on you over psychologize these things. You don't talk about sin enough, or you're just anti-pastors and anti-church, which is tough for me because I was a pastor in Orlando. I was a pastor in San Francisco. I still, in many ways, consider myself a pastor, and I tried to look at this from a very hopeful perspective too. But I would say by and large the reception has been very positive.
Yeah, that's great. Well, you have some hard things to say for pastors, but I'll just say also for the record that I read it and I'm a pastor, and I don't think that you are anti-pastor at all. So,
Agreed.
But let's start here, Chuck. Thanks for providing a little context. So, narcissism, the language of it is now so deeply in the water supply that just as my perspective, I think that we're kind of in a place where we're in danger of, like, if everything is narcissism, nothing is narcissism. And so you just hear this more and more from people, like, well, I couldn't work for that person anymore because he's a narcissist. Well, I can't stay in my marriage anymore because that's a narcissist. And it's a little bit like, well, are you sure about that? So you would be a good person to help us here. Can you just define narcissism for us and talk some about where it comes from?
Yeah, so I think you raise an important point, and it's one of the reasons I wrote it, because I was hearing the very same thing. All church planters are narcissists, things like that, right? And I've been doing church planter assessments and pastoral assessments for 15 years, and that's not what my data was showing, so to speak. Right now, I used some testing that has proven to be very valuable, that has taught me that narcissism is on a spectrum. And certainly there are a number of pastors on a narcissistic spectrum, or one of the close cousins of narcissism out there, like histrionic personality. But that you're on a spectrum doesn't mean that you're a diagnosably narcissistic personality disorder, right? And you might even say that a bit of narcissism, or at least in the way it shows up in certain pastors or church planters, might actually be helpful. And that could be in and of itself a controversial statement, right? But when we're talking about narcissistic personality disorder, like the psychological definition gets at things like grandiosity, entitlement, attention-seeking, low empathy, which is a really important one that people don't often talk about. In fact, that there's not really a capacity to empathize with others. And then some kind of relational and vocational disruption. Like generally, if you're a narcissistic leader, there's some disruption. We could talk about this more if you want to. I've expanded that. I don't think that DSM-5 definition gets at the different faces of narcissism that I elaborate in and through the Enneagram. But what I'd say about, just to get to some of the roots of narcissism quickly, oftentimes people say that narcissism sort of emerges out of self-love or pride or arrogance, as if we're sort of born that way, or our parents are, too positive, too nice to us. And what psychologists have found, is that narcissism really is born out of self-contempt.
Yeah.
Well, these are folks who, at some level, hate themselves and are compensating with a defensive part of them, this grandiose part of them, this kind of narcissistic part of them that has learned to kind of live life shielded and defended, as if behind some sort of castle wall, throwing bombs over the wall. And it's really because there's a kind of fragile interior. And so when I do this work and I really get to that interior, what I find is shame and self-contempt and worthlessness, not superiority, not self-love. And so that's a really interesting point that we can tease out if you want to also.
Well, and it's also profoundly connected to the lack of empathy. Can you tease that out some for our listeners here? So that self-contempt at the core of a person's personality, how is it that cripples empathy?
Yeah, so in a sense, I think the lack of empathy for themselves come first, right? And so there's a sense in which they grew up in a context, like, let me give you a quick example without putting a name, or I conflate stories. So if someone's listening and says, he's telling my story, I'm not telling someone's story. But an example of a pastor who was sexually abused when he was very young, and grew up in a family where there was some neglect, and basically just sort of had a sense of worthlessness that by late middle school, early high school, was mitigated by, I've got some talent in basketball. I'm a good athlete. People kind of like me on the court. I'm a good scorer. And so he sort of develops this identity as the jock, as the guy who's kind of put together, it's got some skills, and that works for him. Finds himself number of years later in seminary. People like him. He's talented. He's charismatic. He's winsome. He's a good communicator. They're willing to put money behind a church plant when he graduates. But in the meantime, has never really looked at some of that underlying stuff, right? And so now he's 40, and now people are coming to him and saying, "You're a bully. You're a narcissist. You're hurting us." And sits down with someone like me, and we begin to tease these things out. And it's like underneath that, there's this sense of, well, the reality is I'm worthless. I'm terrible. I don't think anyone's ever loved me. I've had to go out and get the love that I need in all kinds of different ways. And so, I mean, it's a complicated dynamic, right? Because some will say, well, narcissists are just evil through and through. They're born evil, and I really think that there are stories behind every narcissistic leader.
Chuck, you had mentioned there are ways in which there are certain kinds of narcissism that can actually be helpful or positive, which I had never heard before. I mean, when you hear the word narcissism, you immediately think that's bad. But in your book, you tease out a little bit the fact that there's actually positive aspects of narcissism. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, so I mean, this is really, this goes back to your earliest years, right? Where, when mom and dad say, if you guys have kids, you know this, you got a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, that's great, you're the best fill in the blank ever. There's this sense of, when you're 2 or 3 years old, 5 years old, there's a sense, if you're well loved, that you're, that you're really good at what you do. Yep. And that mom and dad adore you. That's the healthy sense of narcissism. Now, here's the problem. At 5 years old, that's great. At 45 years old, that's a problem. Yep. If at 45 years old, it's like everyone adores me, and I need that. That's the problem. Is I think here's where it's really important to look at the kind of traumatic roots of narcissism, because if you're well loved, you're not going to go looking for it later. Right. If you're well loved, there's going to be this basic sense of security, and there isn't going to be a need for this sort of defensive, narcissistic sort of exterior, right, or defense mechanism that narcissism ends up becoming. And you're simply going to live your life with a basic sense of security. And if you're winsome and you're a good communicator, and by the way, I know a lot of church planters who are winsome, good communicators, inspiring, wooing, and they're not narcissistic at all. Right. They were just well loved, Wow.
Yeah, that's the gift of God.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when we talk about narcissism, it's really rooted in trauma, and there really is a sense of what I'll see when I'm doing this work, and I'm like looking over at my couch right now where I do 5-day counseling intensives, and mostly men, come into my office, and we sit here, and on like day 3 or 4 of a counseling intensive, he'll say to me, I don't think that I've ever had a friend. Whoa. I've always been alone. Whoa. I've always felt so scared. I don't think I've ever belonged. Yeah. And I mean, he might have an entourage around him. I mean, I've seen these guys with literally with entourages around them saying, I've never had a friend. And so there's a profound sense of shame and loneliness and disconnection.
Okay, I want to come back to in a little bit. I love what you're saying about narcissism being connected to trauma. Because there is some conversation out there about is this genetically passed on? In other words, there are some people in society just basically predisposed to this particular kind of sociopathological condition. You're saying something happens to you that isn't dealt with in the right way. And I think if that's true, that means that there's hope for healing that's greater than if this is a genetic thing. So we'll come back to that towards the end. Sure. But I want to ask you, I think one of the things that just stunned me reading your book is that you said in all the years that you've done assessments for church planters, coaching of pastors, therapy for pastors, you find a higher preponderance of narcissists among this population group than, as I understand it, any other population group you've ever worked with. Yeah. Can you talk about why that is? What is it about our church structure, system, culture is both drawing narcissists and, in a lot of ways, cultivating narcissists?
And planters seem to be a little bit higher than even pastors, as I understand that.
And planters
are higher, more prone.
Yeah, well, so This is largely based on my work over the years, and one of the things that I think I'm cognizant of is there needs to be a lot more research on this, and really good research on this. But this is sort of what I've found, right? So now there are 3 clusters of personality disorders, and narcissism is within cluster B, which is more your dramatic personality. Cluster A is more like eccentric personality, and cluster C is more like avoidant personality or dependent. And your eccentric and your kind of avoidant people generally don't go into ministry. Some eccentric. You guys are a little eccentric, but
which cluster are you part of right now? That's what I'm wondering.
But in your kind of cluster B, they're performative. They love the stage, and you combine that with I can get on stage and I can, I can say this is the word of God. There's an interesting sort of cocktail there that I find to be really important when looking at this. And then if you we could probably dedicate a whole podcast to sort of the sociology of the church over the last 30 years. But I sort of came up in the rise of church planting, and particularly city church planting. That's why I was out in San Francisco, a church that was sort of formed in the image of Redeemer in Manhattan, in a denomination that was the fastest growing church planting denomination in the United States. And there was a kind of formula, for lack of a better way. And you guys have probably seen this in the last probably 20, 30 years. There is a kind of church planting formula. You'll generally find it in more white spaces, white male spaces, among particular demographics. But there is this sort of plug and play. This is the kind of personality. Yeah. Having been a part of assessments, this is the kind of person that we're looking for. And it really is sort of a scripted way of this is the kind of church, this is the kind of personality, and this is the recipe. And I think what's happening now is what I'm hearing from church planting assessors, for instance, is they're coming to me and they're saying, we're stepping back and we're taking a look at that recipe, and there are major problems.
Wow.
And there are a number of different the good news is there are a number of different networks and denominations completely rethinking assessment. Yeah. Completely rethinking some of the assumptions that went into here's what makes a really good church planter. Here's what here are the ingredients of a good church plant, right? Right. Here are the expectations of growth. Yep. Here are the numbers, the metrics that you need to hit. There are a number of really good folks, including folks of color, who are looking at this and kind of standing back and saying we need to rethink this from the ground up.
If the core wound is like, I'm not loved, I'm not worthy, it stands to reason then that these people are going to go out and they're going to seek a platform. What is it but a way to heal that inner wound somehow?
So how did you just say that in like one line way better than I did in about a 5 minute? Like that.
I'm on this side of the microphone, so I get to listen and digest and kind of give it back. It's a truly unfair advantage.
I think that's it. I think you just named it and summed it up really beautifully.
Okay. All right. Here's a question for you, just to get into, because I know Jay does as well, you do. So many people who have been wounded by genuine narcissists, and the really unfortunate thing about it is that usually we wake up to it too late. And so it's not until we've been really wounded, we've got our mind is kind of wrapped around the axle, we've been gaslit in some way, all of a sudden we go, oh, crud, this has happened to me. So I wonder if you can talk about early warning signs that you might be in the orbit of a narcissist.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the earliest warning sign is your gut. And what I mean by that is most people don't have, they don't have the categories that maybe I spell out in the book, or Wade Mullen spells out in his really wonderful book, Something's Not Right, or some of the others out there. They don't really have those categories. They're not really looking for the characteristics of, let's say, the narcissistic pastor. What they have is a stirring in their gut that says something feels off. When we were in that meeting, he dressed me down, and when he's around this group of people or when he's on stage, he appears so humble. Yeah. But in the meeting, boy, I just walked away feeling humiliated. That's generally where it begins, and I can't tell you how many people have ignored their gut. I mean, I've worked in any number of different situations across the United States, even internationally, right, where people will say, I had that initial gut feeling 12 years ago, 10 years ago, 8 years ago, and I pushed it down and I ignored it. And I thought it was just me because he's great. Everyone loves him. And there is within narcissistic systems some sense of loyalty. Like, you can't you can't question the narcissistic pastor, you can't question the leader, right? And so that to me, that's where it begins. We could talk more about where it continues, but that's where it begins.
Can we talk more about those characteristics of narcissistic cultures that maybe propagate a form of narcissism unaware? So you mentioned, we can't question the leader. What are, if you just rattle off about 4 or 5 other one of those?
Yeah, well, generally in systems like that, you've got a leader who needs to be large and in charge. Like, there's a sense in which he's you'll begin to tease out that he's sort of protecting his space. He's protecting his power at all costs. And so there's kind of a sensitivity there that if you sort of intrude on his territory of power, you question him, you're going to get the snapback. These are leaders who will sort of bully if they need to. Like they'll look pretty humble or curious, in one context. But as I said a moment ago, they'll dress you down if they need to. There's a sense of entitlement to success. There's sort of a sense of like, listen, I've worked really hard. I have backers behind me. Who are you to come in and question me? I'm entitled to this, right? Within the system, this is an interesting one to me. Like he's the only one that's allowed to change his mind, or be inconsistent or be impulsive. Like let me give you a quick example of this. Like if you come in and say we're not going to be able to execute your plan for the sermon series, that's going to be a real problem. But if he comes in 3 hours before a Sunday morning service and says, I'm going to redo everything and we're going to do different songs and we're going to have different slides, that's okay. So he can be the disruptor, but you're not allowed to. And I think one of the other things that I've noted, and this, I don't know that this is new to me. This is a word that's out there, but I've certainly tried to put words around it. He tends to be more vulnerable than vulnerable, like
F-A-U-X,
vulnerability, right? And so there's a sense in which he's there. People will say, but he's so humble, he's so transparent. He talks about his life, he talks about his marriage, but it's in service of sort of drawing you in and winning you over. But the reality is that doesn't lead to a true acknowledgement of his sin or a real sense of repentance or a grief over how he's hurt you. It's in service of an image. It's in service of we're this kind of church or that kind of church. We're a church that people get counseling or whatever it might be. I mean, I'm just kind of rattling those off.
Well, he's using the vulnerability. I love that you call it vulnerability because it's not. It's a facsimile of the real thing. But what he's doing is he's using the vulnerability to try to recruit you to his cause and draw you into his orbit, and it's not genuinely mutual. So that's why it can't be true vulnerability. It's not a two-way street. You've been recruited. He's gained all of the power from you. You haven't gotten any power from him. So there's I mean, there's no mutuality in the relationship.
There's no mutuality. There's no room for feedback. I mean, you're subject to criticism and feedback, but somehow he's earned the right to not receive feedback. He's impervious to feedback. And the reality is that where and this isn't helpful when you're in it, because when you're in it, it's just really, really painful. But if you get some distance, you realize he can't receive feedback because his deepest narrative about himself is, I'm a phony, I'm a failure, I'm worthless, I'm bad, there's something wrong with me. And so, because secure people are willing to say, well, what do I need to do to change? Give me feedback about how I'm showing up and let me metabolize that so I can be a better leader. And these are folks who are just not willing to receive that.
I'm thinking of somebody else I read recently that said that narcissism is really it's an inappropriate way of metabolizing shame.
That's it.
So
Yeah.
we run away and we metabolize shame in non-relational ways. But
Yeah.
if we can metabolize our embarrassment at our actions or
Yeah.
our failure to live up to a certain standard in relational ways, that actually makes it so that we're a non-narcissistic personality. Is that something that you'd agree with?
Yeah. That's all over the literature on shame.
Okay.
If you don't metabolize your shame, you will end up with some sort of, it might not be the narcissism defense mechanism, right? There'll be some way of protecting yourself that will be harmful to you and harmful to others, right?
Yeah.
And so the work is to metabolize that shame. Well, that requires that you go back into your story, you go back into your narrative, you go back into those. And my experience in doing this is not many want to do that.
Right.
And they're much happier, as we've seen in any number of public examples, doubling down rather than saying, I got a lot to learn. I'm going to take the next decade off from ministry.
Yep.
And as one guy did, who I worked with years and years ago, I'm just gonna get out of ministry. And I remember he contacted me about 8 years later, and he said, Chuck, I'm thinking about getting back into ministry. And I got a little nervous. And he said to me, yeah, I'm just going to clean toilets for a while in churches. And it was really beautiful, actually. There's a beautiful story behind it. But his path back into ministry was really a path of humility because of the work he did, not a path of doubling down.
So